Hey there, YouTube. Welcome back to the Allegheny Northern in N scale, and today we're going to do another, what I think is probably going to end up being a controversial topic, but that is whether or not your layout should include a loop, and if you do, whether or not that loop is realistic. So let me give you my idea of how I run my layout and see if that doesn't help you make your decision when you're planning your layout. Okay, I think at this point pretty much all of you know that the Allegheny Northern is a fictitious railroad. It is based on the railroading of the Allegheny Mountains, so Eastern Seaboard, Norfolk Southern, CSX, and of course the Allegheny Northern. Now, in all of that, what I was trying to do was capture the flavor of an area. So I wanted large trains, big locomotives, hauling coal, intermodal, mixed freight, steel, that sort of thing. That's what I was going for, because that is the areas and the services I am most familiar with. And all of my layouts, and this is number 6 or 7 at this point, have had one feature that is constant. The seasons have changed, the track design has changed, but every one of them has had a loop. And I know that there's a lot of prototype modelers out there that just absolutely abhor loops because they're not prototypical. And true, in real life, the real thing does not loop back on itself. And although you may have a train leave a station only to return back to that station later in the day, or a train leave a yard to return back to that yard later in the day, it's not really running loops. It's running from one point to another point where it's performing its tasks and then it's returning. And so loops in railroading, not really a thing. Okay, so you would say, well, if you're trying to create a realistic layout, you also cannot have a loop on your layout. And for those of you who are modeling specific branch lines or specific lines or segments of lines, you may not want to have a loop because the track's not actually going to loop. But even still, you could add a non-realistic loop just so that your trains return if you so wanted. I know it takes away from some of the realism. Probably a lot of you cringed if you're one of those types of modelers. But for most of us, we all have a loop. So let's talk about why we have the loops and why they may or may not be good for what we're trying to do. Okay, for me, my layout, all of my layouts, have always had loops. My layouts from now until the end of time, which hopefully this is the last one that I actually have to build, will always have loops. I like loops on my railroads. Why? Because sometimes I don't want to have an operating session. Sometimes I don't want to run fast clocks. Sometimes I don't want to switch industries. I get a lot of enjoyment from watching my trains run. And I can spend hours building trains and watching them run around and just enjoying the scenery that I built and watching the locomotives run. You guys know I have a locomotive addiction. Well, what the hell is the sense of having all of these locomotives if I can't run them? Oh, well, that locomotive doesn't look right on that train. It's a model. We gotta have fun. We gotta do what we enjoy, and I enjoy watching my trains run. So my layouts will always have loops. And to me, that does not take away from the realism, because in my mind, I'm watching the layout run through a scenery. I'm not necessarily watching it run through, something just shorted out there. And I'm not necessarily watching it, run through the same town. In my mind, it's just running through my scenery. Okay, so that's all well and good, but let me tell you how I am going to be running the Allegheny Northern. So, when I just want to do that, I want to watch trains run, I can do exactly what I'm doing now. And that is set my train up to run loops and watch it go. But when I'm actually operating my layout, that means I'm actually actively at the throttle and I'm doing something, whether it's switching out the gravel company or whatever. I can run my layout point to point. And I guess I should probably clarify that I'm not actually running the layout point to point. My trains are going point to point. Therefore, they will not be using the reverse loops to turn back on themselves. They will be moving their locomotive power from the front of the train to the back of the train. They'll be going from industry to industry, and they'll be going through the strategic yards and sidings and all that stuff that is laid out for them so that they can operate more prototypically. And there will be cases where a train simply starts at a yard and it will end in a completely different yard. And it will never go through the automatic reversing sections. It'll run point to point. So if the big boy was carrying this mixed freight, and this mixed freight was starting at the upper yard and ending in the lower yard, it would simply run the layout from wherever it needed to go, wherever it was at, to wherever it was going to finish, and it would go through each section of the layout one time. It may switch out its cars, pick up a different train, and return, but it would not be the exact same cars, the exact same train, heading in the exact same direction. So that is how I plan on operating the Allegheny Northern. It is going to essentially run point to point. But on both the upper deck and the lower deck, I am going to have the option to do just what I'm doing right now, and that is watch trains roll through. So you'll hear a lot of discussion. You'll see a lot of people talking about it because there's, just like which locomotive brand is the favorite, there's a lot of people who don't want loops on their layout because they aren't realistic. And if you are one of those people, there's no shame in that. There's only shame in that is if you would shame somebody else for having a loop on their layout, because there's nothing wrong with that either. But a lot of what you're going to design in your layout is going to depend on what you want from your layout. So let's talk about what you may or may not want from your layout. Okay, so the first thing that comes into layout planning is, well, space. If you only have the space for a door size layout or a shelf layout, maybe you're doing some kind of a switching layout, guess what you're not going to have? You're probably not going to have big trains running loops. You may have small trains running loops, but you're not going to have big freight trains running loops. And if that is something that you want, you're probably not going to get the most enjoyment out of your layout, because you're not going to be able to run big, long coal drags or intermodals, or maybe even passenger cars. Especially if you got tight turns and radius and everything else, that could be a little bit of a problem for you. So you got to build the layout type that you have space for. And if you want nice long industries, you may not have the ability to put a loop in as well if space doesn't allow for it. Now, you might be able to run something behind the backdrop or under the layout and build some staging underneath the layout so that your train can run a loop. If you want to put like a double helix in or something like that. So there's a lot of different things in designing your layout that you can sort of get around some of those pitfalls of space. But ultimately, if you want to say model a steel mill, there are entire layouts that are simply the steel mill itself, because there's so much track and there's so much stuff to model a steel mill accurately. You need a lot of space. Yeah, they made some kits and blast furnace and all of that sort of stuff, but if you look at the folks who modeled specific steel mills, they are sprawling. There are multiple furnaces, there are multiple rolling mills, there are yards and tracks, and just, it's stuff everywhere. And that's pretty much how the real thing looks. And so you got to kind of think about space. Do you have the space for a loop, or is the loop all you have space for? And so most of us start with a basic loop of track to begin with and build from there. Now, if I was building a layout, I would try to stay away from multiple zigzagging loops that all kind of intersect, because yeah, it looks more toy trainish at that point. But if that's what you want to do and your goal is to run trains, no harm in that. Now, if you have a lot of space, you have a lot more options on what you can do. Okay, I like loops because I like to be able to watch my trains run. And as I'm filming this, I realize I'm spending most of my time down here just watching trains run. I will set the trains to run when I'm working on scenery. and working on other projects, just because I like to look up and like to stop and watch my train roll through. And that's where I get a good portion of my enjoyment from the hobby, is watching this. So that's why I like the loop. And it's nice to be able to have the space to build a layout that I can operate both with a loop or without a loop. And you do need a lot of run for that. I fortunately have a lot of run. So if you don't have enough run to do something like that, what you do probably have space for is maybe a switching layout. Okay, probably not going to have a loop, but it doesn't need one, because you're just doing a simple, well, maybe complex, but you're doing an industry that, or a series of industries that needs a locomotive that's basically going to slide back and forth along the layout to accomplish what the layout's goal is. Or you can have a small layout that is a tabletop type layout that is running a loop, and that is perfectly fine. Maybe there's an industry or two, maybe it's a starter layout, maybe it's all you have time and money for. And you're getting to watch your train run, you're getting to maybe set out a few cars, pick up a few cars, and it's providing all the enjoyment that you possibly could want from your layout. Not an issue in any case. And what I find is that the model railroad community is broken up into three types of models. There are gatekeepers, and they are the people who, you have to model this way, this is the way it should be done, this is the correct way, and if you don't do it this way, well, then you're just an idiot and you don't belong in model railroading. Okay? And there's a lot of folks that model that way, and those people, you should stay away from them. You should not watch their channels. They're just not good people for the hobby, because they discourage people from joining. Then you have the exact opposite. You have the cheerleaders who think that everything is wonderful, life is so grand, and they're obnoxious for the exact opposite reason. Instead of being a limiting factor, they make it sound like everybody can do everything and everybody gets a trophy, and it's just, oh, no, okay? We covered that in another video where it's, there are skill sets, and you have to abide by your skill set, and you have to improve your skill set to get better. And that's probably why you're here. You're learning something new on YouTube, whether it's from me, from other channels. You're learning stuff to make you a better modeler, to inspire you, stuff like that. And then there's the group that most of us fall in, and it's right smack in the middle. And that is, we have certain things we like to do, certain ways we like to do it. We acknowledge that there are other ways that can be done, but we pick this way for a reason, and we tell you what that reason is. Not saying we're necessarily right, but we have our reasons for doing what we do, and we have our reasons for doing or not doing what we don't want to do, and we explain it to you and let you choose which one is the correct way for you. And at the end of the day, that's pretty much my take on the loop layout. You're either going to run a loop because you want to watch your trains run, or you're going to go uber realistic, and you're going to just, that is it. Real trains don't run in loops. My train's not going to run a loop. And either way you go, you're both right and wrong to somebody else online. And so in my case, if you're running point to point, that's wrong for me. That's not my style. That's not what I want. It's how I'm going to operate my layout. But right now, I just want to watch some trains run, and I have the ability to do that. But conversely, I don't want a layout that's just all mainline with no actual action where I can do anything, because, well, I want to be able to actually run my trains and give them purpose. And so if I had modeled simply scenery and empty, nothingness going through little towns and whatnot, but I couldn't set out cars, I couldn't stop at stations, that would also be boring to me, because I like both facets of modeling, watching my trains and switching industries. So for you guys, what is the correct layout type? And the only person in the room that can answer that, well, it's you, because it's your layout and it's going to run how you want to run it. And if you want to run a loop, run that loop. Run multiple loops. Run all the loops. If you prefer something different, point-to-point switching, maybe that's what space allows for, go for it. At the end of the day, the answer is right by whatever it is you are so choosing. It does seem to me, though, if you're going to spend a lot of money and buy some really awesome locomotives, you probably want to run them.